Is this a joke? Or did your mother forget to teach you about boundaries along with the dusting? Victoria Antony's voice cut through the silence of the study like a whip. She didn't even look up from her ivory knight. This board costs more than your college fund, child. Don't touch what you can't understand. Joseph Williams didn't flinch. He stood in the center of the Persian rug, his posture straighter than the Grandmaster sitting across from her. I understand enough to know you're about to lose your queen, and I'm willing to bet on it. The Grandmaster, Henry Lockhart, paused mid-sip of his espresso, his championship ring catching the light. A bet? Listen here, kid. I've dismantled world champions from Moscow to New York. What could a 12-year-old possibly offer me? Because, Joseph interrupted, his eyes locking onto the Grandmaster's with an intensity that bordered on predatory. You've spent your whole life playing against people who have trophies to lose. You've never played someone who's fighting for a life. What happened next in that luxurious Manhattan penthouse would become a legend whispered in every chess club from Harlem to the Upper East Side. A single mother's career was the stake. A Grandmaster's legacy was the target. And a young boy was about to prove that the most dangerous piece on the board is the one you never saw coming. Dear viewer, I humbly request you to watch or listen till the end and rate this story out of 10. Your rating will help me to give you better stories in the next videos. If you are watching my story for the first time, kindly subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon now so as not to miss the notifications of my daily published new stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Joseph Williams had learned the art of being a ghost long before his 12th birthday. It was a survival skill perfected by the children of the invisible. Walking silently through the marble corridors of the Antony estate, breathing softly so as not to disturb the heavy scent of lilies and expensive floor wax, existing in a world that used his mother's hands but refused to see her face. His mother, Tanya, had been the head housekeeper for the Antony family for 3 years. In that time, Joseph had become a master of the cracked door, watching the lives of the elite through thin openings, learning their habits, their weaknesses, and, most importantly, their games. The Antony penthouse was a fortress of glass and ego. 20-foot ceilings overlooked a rain-blurred Central Park, and the furniture was curated with the cold precision of a museum. Mrs. Victoria Antony, a woman whose social standing was as sharp and polished as her diamonds, ran the household like a military operation. She had a protocol for everything: the specific silver polish for the tea service, the exact angle of the throw pillows, and the absolute rule that the staff's children were to remain in the basement quarters. But today was a lapse in protocol. Today, Victoria's brother, the legendary Henry Lockhart, had arrived for a private match. Joseph had seen Lockhart on the covers of magazines his father used to keep under his bed. Henry Lockhart, the man who saw the board in 11 dimensions, the 53-year-old titan who hadn't been checked in a decade. Joseph pressed his shoulder against the mahogany door frame of the study, his breath hitching as he watched the game. The sunlight hit the board, turning the ebony pieces into jagged shadows. Lockhart was playing a clinical version of the Queen's gambit, his fingers moving with a bored, rhythmic grace. "You're leaning into the trap, Victoria," Lockhart murmured, his voice heavy with the boredom of easy victory. "You're playing the man, not the board." Victoria laughed, a brittle, hollow sound. "I don't have time for grand theories, Henry. I have a board of directors to manage. This is just a hobby." Joseph leaned further, his eyes darting across the squares. He saw it instantly. Lockhart wasn't just winning, he was toying with her. He had left a deliberate opening on the king's side, a loo that looked like a blunder. If Victoria took the bait, Lockhart's knight would deliver a smothered mate in 5 moves. Joseph. A sharp, panicked whisper came from behind him. Tanya stood at the end of the hall, her apron cinched tight over her tired frame. What are you doing? I told you to stay in the kitchen. If they see you here. Mama, look, Joseph whispered, pointing through the gap. She's going for the night. She doesn't see the discovered check. She's walking into a graveyard. Joseph Williams, get away from that door this instant. Tanya hissed, her voice trembling with the fear of a woman who knew how quickly a mistake could lead to an eviction notice. But the carpet was thick, and their whispers had carried. The heavy door swung wide, and Victoria Anthony stood there, looking down at them as if they were a stain on her pristine hardwood. Tanya, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. I believe I was very clear about the no visibility policy for your son. Does he need a formal invitation to leave my sight? I'm so sorry, Mrs. Anthony, Tanya stammered, her hand catching Joseph's shoulder to pull him away. He's just a boy. He was curious. We're leaving now. Victoria's eyes didn't soften. She looked at Joseph with a clinical sort of disgust. Curiosity is for those who can afford the time. People like you should focus on being useful, not observant. Henry Lockhart appeared in the doorway behind his sister, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. He didn't look annoyed. He looked intrigued by the fire he saw in the boy's eyes. What's the boy looking at, Victoria? Nothing that concerns him, she snapped, turning back to the table. Just a child who doesn't know when to look down. But Joseph didn't look down. He looked directly at the Grandmaster. You're going to lose in 7 moves. And you're doing it on purpose just to see if she's paying attention. The silence that followed was absolute. Tanya's heart hammered against Joseph's back. Victoria turned around, her face turning a pale, angry red. What did you just say? Joseph didn't blink. The bishop's sacrifice on F7. It looks like a gift, but it's a cage. You're going to lose in 7 moves, Mrs. Anthony, because you're playing the person you think he is, instead of the board he's actually setting. Henry Lockhart let out a genuine, booming laugh that shook the room. The kid's got eyes. He's right, Victoria. I was going to end you in 7. He turned to Joseph, his smile fading into a professional squint. How did you see that, kid? That's a Grandmaster level red. Joseph thought of his father's hands, the smell of cheap coffee in Detroit, and the years of being told he was nothing. Because, Joseph said, stepping into the room, I've been watching you play for 3 years. And you always play the same way when you're bored. The air in the study thickened, the kind of heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a lightning strike. Tanya's hand was a cold weight on Joseph's shoulder, her fingers trembling so violently he could feel her heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt. To her, this room was a minefield where a single misplaced word could obliterate the fragile life she had built for them. But to Joseph, the room had shrunk. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, and the staggering arrogance of Victoria Anthony had all bled into the background. There was only the board, the 6-4 squares where the world finally made sense. You cannot be serious, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. She stood up, her silk blouse shimmering under the recessed lighting. Tanya, Take this child out of my sight before I decide that your inability to control him is a fireable offense. Tanya's voice was a ragged plea. Mrs. Anthony, please. He's just a boy. He doesn't know what he's saying. Joseph, apologize right now. Tell them you're sorry. Joseph didn't look at his mother. He couldn't. If he looked at her face, at the lines of exhaustion and the terror in her eyes, his resolve might crack. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on Henry Lockhart. The Grandmaster was watching him with the detached, clinical interest of a man who had found a rare specimen in an unlikely place. I'm not sorry, Joseph said, his voice ringing out with a clarity that startled even him. And I'm not playing. I'm making an offer. Victoria let out a sharp, jagged laugh. An offer? From the help? Henry, do you hear this? The child thinks he's at a negotiating table. Let him speak, Victoria, Lockhart said quietly. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, the gold of his championship ring catching a stray beam of light. I want to hear what he thinks his silence is worth. Joseph stepped forward, moving out from under his mother's hand. He felt as though he was stepping off a cliff, but the air beneath him felt solid. If I win, you double my mother's salary. You give her a contract that says she can't be fired without cause for 5 years. And you treat her with the respect she earned at Howard. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria's face went from a pale ivory to a blotchy, livid red. She looked as though she might physically strike him. You insolent little. And if you lose? Lockhart interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Joseph took a breath that tasted of old books and expensive tobacco. If I lose, my mother leaves today. No severance. No references. We walk out that door and you never have to look at us again. Joseph, no. Tanya gasped, her voice breaking. She turned to Victoria, her hands clasped in front of her chest. Mrs. Anthony, please, he's a child. He doesn't understand what he's risking. We need this job. Please, I'll work the next month for free. Just don't listen to him. Victoria's eyes shifted from Tanya's desperate face to Joseph's mask of icy calm. A slow, cruel smile began to spread across her lips. It wasn't the smile of a chess player. It was the smile of a predator who had just been handed a gift. She saw a way to rid herself of the inconvenience of Joseph once and for all, while asserting her total dominance over Tanya. You have a deal, boy, Victoria said. Victoria, wait, Lockhart said, his brow furrowing. This is a bit much, don't you think? He's 12. You're a 3-time state champion. This isn't a game, it's an execution. He set the terms, Henry, she snapped, her eyes never leaving Joseph. He wants to play with the adults. Then he can face adult consequences. Or perhaps he'd like to admit right now that he's nothing but a loudmouthed child and crawl back to the kitchen. Joseph felt the heat of his mother's tears on his arm as she stood behind him, silent now, paralyzed by the enormity of the gamble. He thought about the basement apartment with the leaky pipes. He thought about his mother's swollen feet every night and the way she looked at the grocery bills like they were death warrants. He thought about his father's voice, whispering that the board was the only place where the world was fair. I'm not crawling anywhere, Joseph said. He walked toward the mahogany table. The ivory and ebony pieces seemed to glow under the lights, heavy and ancient. He felt the weight of the room's history, a room where deals were made that moved millions of dollars, where people like him were usually only invited to clean the ashtrays. Henry Lockhart stood up and moved to the side, acting as an impromptu arbiter. His expression was no longer bored. It was tense, settled into the grim focus of a man watching a high-wire act. "Standard tournament rules," Lockhart announced. "Touch move is in effect. Clocks aren't necessary for this exhibition. Victoria, you have the white pieces. You move first." Victoria sat down, her tennis bracelets clinking against the edge of the table. She adjusted her blazer, looking across the board at Joseph as if he were a smudge she was about to wipe away. "I'm going to enjoy this, Joseph. I'm going to make sure you remember this move for the rest of your very long, very difficult life." Joseph sat in the oversized leather chair. His feet barely touched the floor, and he looked small against the backdrop of the massive library. But when his hands came up to rest on the edge of the table, they were perfectly still. The trembling had vanished. He was no longer the maid's son. He was a player. "Set up the board," Joseph said, his voice dropping into a register of cold authority that silenced Victoria's next insult. He reached out and spun the board slightly, aligning the squares to his liking. He looked at the white pieces, then at the black. "I'll take black," he said. It was a statement of intent. In chess, white has the advantage of the first move, the initiative. By choosing black, Joseph was telling her that he didn't need the head start. He was telling her that he would let her strike first, and then he would dismantle her piece by piece. Tanya stood by the door, her face buried in her hands, unable to watch but unable to leave. Victoria reached out, her manicured fingers gripping the king's pawn. With a smirk of pure, unadulterated confidence, she pushed it forward to e4. The game had begun. The wages of courage were on the table. And for the first time in his life, Joseph Williams wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was the shadow, and he was about to swallow the room whole. The heavy mahogany door to the study remained closed, sealing the four of them into a space that felt increasingly like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Victoria Anthony leaned over the board, her movements fluid and practiced, her every gesture designed to broadcast an effortless superiority that she expected Joseph to crumble under. After her opening move of e4, she didn't wait for Joseph to respond before she began her real attack. "You know, Tanya," Victoria said, her eyes never leaving the ivory pieces. "I've always found it fascinating how some people mistake proximity to excellence for the excellence itself. Just because your son sits in a room with a Grandmaster doesn't mean he breathes the same air." Joseph didn't look up. His small, dark hand reached out and gripped his c-pawn, sliding it forward to c5. It was the Sicilian defense, the most aggressive, combative response in the history of the game. It was a move that screamed he wasn't there to survive. He was there to hunt. Henry Lockhart's eyebrows shot up. He recognized the sharp intent behind the move, but Victoria merely scoffed, responding instantly with her knight to f3. "A college degree from Howard, wasn't it, Tanya?" Victoria continued, her tone conversational yet dripping with a calculated poison. "All that effort, all those years of study, only to end up specialized in the exact pH balance of my marble cleaner. It's a tragic waste of potential, really. But I suppose it runs in the family, reaching for things that are simply out of your biological depth." Tanya stood by the bookshelves, her knuckles white as she gripped the hem of her apron. She looked as though she wanted to scream, to defend the years she had spent over textbooks while working 2 jobs, but the weight of the wager kept her silent. Every insult Victoria hurled was a reminder of what they stood to lose if Joseph's fingers slipped. Joseph felt the heat of the mockery rising in his chest. It was a familiar fire, the same one that burned when he saw his mother crying over a utility bill or when the Antony's guests looked right through him as if he were part of the furniture. Usually, that rage made him want to break things. Today, he forced it into the tips of his fingers. He moved his pawn to d6, solidifying his structure. The Sicilian, Lockhart murmured, almost to himself. Sharp. Very sharp. It's a child's bravado, Henry, Victoria dismissed, pushing her pawn to d4 to challenge the center. Joseph exchanged the pawns, and the board opened up, becoming a landscape of traps and jagged edges. He's playing a game he learned from YouTube and park benches. He doesn't understand that chess is a language of the elite. It requires a certain pedigree, a history of refinement that a kitchen worker's son simply cannot replicate. She looked directly at Joseph then, her smile thin and predatory. Are you enjoying the view from that chair, Joseph? It's likely the last time you'll ever sit in leather this expensive. By Monday, you'll be helping your mother pack her bags in a basement somewhere. I hope this little moment of ego was worth her career. Joseph's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his face remained a mask of stone. He thought of his father, who had played Grandmasters in smoke-filled Detroit clubs and won, only to be denied entry into the formal tournaments because of the color of his skin or the holes in his coat. He remembered his father telling him, "The board doesn't have a memory. It doesn't know who your mother is. It only knows the truth of the move." He developed his knight to f6, attacking Victoria's center. She responded by bringing her knight to c3, reinforcing her position. The game was moving at a blistering pace, the pieces clicking against the board with the rhythm of a firing squad. "I heard your father was a player, too," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "A street master, I think they called them. Is that where you learned this? Between shifts at a factory? It's a shame he couldn't teach you the most important rule of the world, knowing when you're outclassed. If he had, maybe he would have left you something more than a cleaning lady for a mother and a head full of delusions." At that, Joseph's hand paused. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. Tanya let out a small, choked sob, her eyes pleading with Joseph to stay calm. Lockhart shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the cruelty of his sister's words finally crossing a line even he found distasteful. But Joseph didn't break. He didn't cry. Instead, he looked at Victoria's g4 pawn, the beginning of the English attack, a brutal, kingside assault designed to crush Black's position. She was playing aggressively, her overconfidence making her reckless. She thought she was swatting a fly. She didn't realize she had stepped into a web. Joseph channeled every ounce of the rage he felt for his mother's dignity, for his father's forgotten talent, and for his own invisible life into the next move. He slid his pawn to a6, the Maid'S variation. It was a quiet, profound move, the signature of a champion. It was a move that said he wasn't afraid of her attack. He was inviting it. "My father taught me everything," Joseph said, his voice quiet and cold, cutting through Victoria's laughter. "And the first thing he taught me was that a queen is just a piece. And even a queen can be taken by a pawn if she thinks she's untouchable." Victoria's eyes narrowed, the mockery faltering for a split second as she looked down at the board. The position had become incredibly complex, a tangle of mathematical possibilities that required absolute focus. She pushed her bishop to e3, completing her development, but her movements were no longer fluid. They were stiff. Joseph responded by preparing to castle, his pieces slowly coiling like a spring. The psychological warfare was failing. The more Victoria talked, the more Joseph retreated into the cold, silent logic of the game. He was no longer a boy in a penthouse. He was a master architect, and he was currently building Victoria Antony's funeral pyre, one square at a time. The mid-afternoon sun shifted, casting long, skeletal shadows across the mahogany board as the game entered the treacherous waters of the middle game. The silence in the study had become a living thing, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to be counting down the minutes of Tanya's employment. Victoria Antony's initial bravado had curdled into a stiff, defensive posture. Her fingers no longer danced over the pieces. They hovered, hesitant, as she realized the boy across from her wasn't just reacting to her moves. He was anticipating them. Victoria pushed her g-pawn forward again, a desperate attempt to reignite her kingside attack and regain the psychological high ground. "You're playing a very dangerous game, Joseph," she murmured, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "You've overextended. Your king is staring down a firing squad, and your mother is staring down the unemployment line." Joseph didn't respond. He was deep in the grind, that mental space where the world of marble and silk vanished, replaced by a crystalline grid of infinite trajectories. He could see the cracks in Victoria's position, the subtle weaknesses created by her aggressive pawn pushes. She had reached for power and left her own king's house unguarded. He saw the path to victory, but it required a leap of faith that most seasoned players would be too terrified to take. With a hand that was unnervingly steady, Joseph reached out and moved his pawn to h5. It was a blatant provocation. To an amateur eye, it looked like a catastrophic blunder, a gift of material that would allow Victoria to shatter his defensive structure and flood his kingside with her pieces. Victoria's eyes widened. A sharp, triumphant breath escaped her throat. "There it is," she whispered, a predatory glint returning to her gaze. "The amateur finally shows his face. You just threw away the only thing protecting your king, Joseph. Tanya, I hope you have your bags packed, because your son just lost you your home." She snatched the pawn from the board with a flourish, her jewelry clinking like a victory march. She looked up at her brother, expecting him to join in her ridicule, but the expression on Henry Lockhart's face made the blood drain from her cheeks. Lockhart wasn't laughing. He was leaning so far forward he was nearly touching the board, his eyes wide and fixed on the vacated square. He wasn't looking at the lost pawn. He was looking at the diagonal Joseph had just opened. He was looking at the way Joseph's bishop was suddenly eyeing the white king like a sniper through a scope. "Victoria," Lockhart said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Look at the board. Really look at it." "What are you talking about, Henry?" "He gave me the pawn. It's a gift." "It's not a gift," Lockhart whispered, a trace of genuine coloring his words. "It's a lure. He didn't lose that pawn, Victoria. He murdered it to clear a path." Joseph remained motionless, his eyes dark and unreadable. He had sacrificed more than a piece of wood. He had sacrificed his safety to create a vacuum that would suck Victoria's pieces out of position. It was a move of pure, calculated genius, the kind of sacrifice his father had practiced on those old park benches when the stakes were just a few dollars and a bit of pride. Here, the stakes were everything, and the pressure was a physical weight on his shoulders. Tanya sensed the shift in the room. She didn't understand the geometry of the Sicilian defense, but she understood the change in the Grandmaster's breathing. She saw the way Lockhart's hand shook as he reached for his glasses. For the first time since the wager was made, the terror in her chest began to give way to a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Victoria looked back at the board, her brow furrowed in sudden, panicked concentration. She began to trace the lines of the pieces, her eyes darting from Joseph's knight to his rook, then back to the open diagonal. The realization hit her like a physical blow. By taking the pawn, she had opened a door she couldn't close. Joseph's pieces were no longer just defending. They were coiling, ready to strike at the heart of her position. "No," she muttered, her face turning a ghostly shade of gray. "That can't be right. He's 12. He can't have seen that far ahead." "He saw it 3 moves ago," Lockhart said, his gaze shifting from the board to Joseph. There was a new respect in the Grandmaster's eyes, a look one professional gives another. "He didn't play the pawn, Victoria. He played you. He knew exactly how much you wanted to hurt him, and he used that hunger to lead you into a graveyard." The tension in the study reached a breaking point. The air seemed to hum with the electricity of a collapsing empire. Joseph finally looked up, his eyes meeting Victoria's. The invisible boy was gone. In his place was a master of the board, a child who had lived his life in the shadows and had finally learned how to use them as a weapon. "It's your move, Mrs. Anthony," Joseph said, his voice as cold and sharp as a winter wind. "But you should know, the graveyard is already full." The silence in the penthouse had shifted from a heavy weight to a sharp, electric hum. Victoria Anthony stared at the board, her hand hovering over her king as if she were afraid the wooden piece might burn her. Her pawn-snatching greed in the previous move had left her center hollow and her flank exposed. Joseph didn't wait for the scent of her fear to dissipate. He struck with the cold, mathematical brutality of a storm that had been brewing for generations. He moved his knight to e5, centralizing the piece with a definitive click. It was the first gear in a machine that was suddenly, terrifyingly in motion. Victoria tried to retreat, pulling her queen back to defend, but Joseph's rook cut across the 7th rank, slicing off her king's escape route like a closing gate. Every piece Joseph owned was now in perfect, lethal harmony, whispering a language of geometry that Victoria could no longer translate. "You're flailing, Victoria," Henry Lockhart whispered, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. He wasn't looking at his sister anymore. He was looking at Joseph as if the boy were a ghost of a Grandmaster. "He's not just attacking your pieces. He's hunting your king." Joseph's hand moved again, bishop to g4. Check. Victoria's king was forced to step out of its fortress, stumbling into the open center of the board. She moved it to d2, her face flushing a deep, humiliated purple. Joseph responded instantly. Queen to b6. Check. "My father used to tell me that the world is built on lines you aren't allowed to cross," Joseph said, his voice quiet but carrying through the room like a bell. He didn't look up, his focus entirely on the white king that was now wandering aimlessly across the mahogany squares. "He told me that in this city, there are elevators we only ride to clean, and rooms we only enter to serve. He said that out there, the rules are written by people who look like you." He moved his knight again, a devastating check that forced Victoria's king further toward the edge, toward the wrong side of the board. "But he taught me something else. Joseph continued, his fingers brushing the ebony head of his king. He said that the board is the only place where those lines don't exist. He'd sit me down at that old splintered table in the park and tell me, Joseph, remember this. Chess is the only place in the world where a black king stands equal to a white one. On these 6-4 squares, the only thing that matters is the truth of your move, not the zip code of your birth. Tanya stood by the window, her breath catching. She remembered her husband saying those exact words, his voice thick with a pride the world had tried to beat out of him. She saw him now in the set of Joseph's jaw, in the way the boy refused to flinch as he dismantled the pride of a woman who had tried to make him feel small. Victoria's king was now at the mercy of Joseph's coordinated battery. She moved her king to C1, a desperate attempt to hide behind her remaining pawns. But Joseph's rook swooped in, a black bird of prey, checking her again. There was no safety left. Every square she fled to was already occupied by the ghost of Joseph's next move. This is impossible, Victoria hissed, her voice cracking. You're a child. You're nothing. I'm the player you didn't think was worth your time, Joseph replied. He slid his queen to D4, a move so precise it felt like a surgical incision. The white king was trapped. It stood on the edge of the board, stripped of its guards, surrounded by ebony pieces that moved with a singular, collective will. The king hunt was nearing its end. Joseph had chased Victoria's most powerful piece from its throne to the gutter of the board, mirroring the very displacement she had threatened him with only minutes before. Henry Lockhart leaned back, a look of profound realization settling on his face. He saw the final combination 3 moves before it landed. It wasn't just a win, it was a masterpiece. He looked at Joseph, then at the trembling Victoria, and finally at Tanya. The power dynamic in the room had flipped so completely that the luxury of the penthouse now felt like a fragile stage set about to collapse. Joseph reached out, his hand hovering over his final piece. He didn't look like a boy who was afraid of losing his home anymore. He looked like a king who had finally claimed his crown. You spent the whole game talking about my mother's place, Mrs. Anthony, Joseph said, his eyes finally meeting hers. But you forgot to look at your own. Check. The White King had no way left to run. The hunt was over, and the silence that followed was the sound of a world changing. The silence that followed Joseph's final check was not empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the sudden collapse of a social order that had stood for generations within the walls of the Anthony penthouse. Victoria stared at the board, her eyes darting frantically across the squares, searching for a ghost of an escape, a single move that wouldn't lead to the death of her king. But there was nothing. Every square was a blade, every piece of Joseph's an executioner. The logic was inescapable, a mathematical cage built from ivory and ebony. Her hand, adorned with a diamond-encrusted watch that could have paid for Joseph's entire education, hovered over the board. It shook with a primal, uncontrollable tremor. Slowly, as if the wooden piece weighed 1,000 pounds, she reached out and tipped her white king. It clattered against the mahogany surface, a hollow, wooden sound that seemed to echo through the vaulted ceilings like a gavel. I resign, she whispered, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. But the moment of grace was short-lived. The shock of defeat quickly curdled into a frantic, ugly desperation. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the polished floor. She looked at Tanya, who was weeping silently by the window, then at Joseph, who remained seated, his face as calm as the surface of a deep well. "No," Victoria snapped, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "This is impossible. Henry, did you see that? He's 12 years old. He's the son of a maid. There is no way, absolutely no way, he could have calculated that line. He was cheating. He had to be." She whirled on Joseph, her finger pointing at him like a weapon. "What do you have in your pockets? Are you wearing an earpiece? Is someone feeding you moves from the hallway? Tanya, did you set this up? Is this some pathetic, elaborate scheme to swindle me?" Tanya flinched as if she had been struck, her face pale with fresh terror. "Mrs. Anthony, I swear. Joseph wouldn't. He doesn't even have a phone that works in here. Don't lie to me." Victoria screamed, her composure completely shattered. "It's a fraud. It has to be a fraud. No one from your background, with your lack of breeding and education, plays a game like that. It's an insult to the sport. Henry, tell her. Tell them this doesn't count." Henry Lockhart stood up slowly. He had been a Grandmaster for 30 years. He had seen the greatest minds in the world crumble under pressure, but he had never seen a display of talent as pure or as devastating as what he had just witnessed. He looked at his sister, and for the first time, his eyes weren't filled with the bored indulgence of a sibling. They were filled with a cold, piercing disappointment. "Sit down, Victoria," Lockhart said, his voice quiet but carrying the absolute weight of his authority. "Henry, he cheated. Look at the coordination, the sacrifice on H5. That's computer-level play. He's a genius," Lockhart interrupted, his voice cutting through her hysterics like a scalpel. "And you are making a fool of yourself. I sat 3 feet away from him the entire time. There were no devices. There were no signals. There was only a boy who understood the soul of the Sicilian defense better than most of the masters I've played in London or Berlin." He walked around the table, his gaze fixed on the board, tracing the path Joseph had carved through Victoria's defenses. "That sacrifice wasn't a computer move, Victoria. It was a human move. It was a move born of intuition, of rage, and of a profound understanding of how you play. He didn't just beat you with math. He beat you because he saw exactly how much your own arrogance blinded you to the truth of the board." Victoria slumped back into her chair, the fire of her anger extinguished by the cold water of her brother's words. She looked small now, dwarfed by the very luxury she had used as a shield. Lockhart turned to Joseph. The boy hadn't moved. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't even smiled. He simply sat there, waiting for the world to catch up to the reality of the checkmate. "That wasn't just a game, Joseph," Lockhart said, his voice softening with a rare, genuine respect. "That was a reckoning. I've seen Grandmasters with 50 years of experience who couldn't have navigated that middle game grind with such precision. You didn't cheat. You simply played the board as if it were the only place you were truly free." Lockhart then turned back to his sister, his expression hardening. "The boy didn't break the rules, Victoria. He broke you. And now, I believe there was a wager involved. A wager you were very keen to enforce when you thought you were winning." Victoria looked at Tanya, then back at the boy who had just dismantled her life's philosophy in 6 to 4 squares. The invisible boy was gone. In his place was a giant, and for the first time in the history of the Anthony penthouse, the help was the only one in the room standing tall. "The salary," Joseph said, his voice steady as steel. "Double it. In writing. Now, the heavy silence of the study was broken only by the rhythmic scratching of a fountain pen. Victoria Anthony sat at her desk, her movements stiff and mechanical as she signed the revised employment contract. Every stroke of the pen seemed to physically pain her, a permanent record of the moment her world was upended by the boy she had called a smudge on her floor. When she pushed the paper across the desk, she didn't look at Joseph or Tanya. She looked through them, retreating into a cold, hollow shell of her former self. Tanya reached out, her fingers brushing the ink as if it were a holy relic. The numbers on the page were life-altering: a doubled salary, a guaranteed term, and a level of security she had only dared to dream of while scrubbing the baseboards of this very room. She looked at Joseph, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of disbelief and a mother's fierce, protective pride. He had done more than win a game. He had bought them their lives back. But the afternoon held one final move. Henry Lockhart stepped forward, pulling a heavy, embossed card from his vest pocket. He didn't offer it to Victoria. He held it out to Joseph with the solemnity of a knight bestowing a sword. "This is for the Kellerman Lockhart Academy," Henry said, his voice resonant in the quiet room. "It's a full-ride scholarship, tuition, travel, tournament fees, and master-level coaching. I don't give these out for potential, Joseph. I give them to players who have the one thing you can't teach, the soul of a predator." Joseph took the card, the gold leaf edges catching the light. He looked at the name on the front and then back at the Grandmaster. "When do I start?" "The New York State Open is in 3 weeks," Lockhart replied with a faint, knowing smile. "I suspect the rankings are about to be thrown into absolute chaos. They won't know what hit them when a 12-year-old with a king hunt in his blood walks through the door." Joseph nodded once, a sharp, professional gesture that signaled the end of the match. He turned to his mother and took her hand. For the first time in 3 years, they didn't wait for a nod of dismissal or a polite wave to leave. They simply walked. As they moved through the marble hallways, the penthouse felt different. The crystal chandeliers were still there. The floor-to-ceiling windows still framed the sprawling green of Central Park, and the air still smelled of expensive lilies. But the weight was gone. Joseph didn't press his shoulder against the walls to avoid being seen. He didn't walk on the balls of his feet to silence his footsteps. He walked down the center of the corridor, his sneakers squeaking rhythmically on the polished stone, a sound of defiance and presence. When they reached the heavy oak front door, the uniformed porter reached out to open it. He looked at Joseph, really looked at him, with a newfound flicker of recognition. News traveled fast in the world of the invisible, and the story of the Maid'S son who had broken the Grandmaster was already beginning to breathe. They stepped out onto Fifth Avenue, the cool New York air hitting them like a benediction. The city was loud, chaotic, and indifferent, but as Joseph looked at the crowds of people rushing past, he no longer felt like a ghost among them. He felt like a threat. He felt like the most dangerous player in the city, carrying a legacy in his pocket and a fire in his heart that no marble palace could ever extinguish. Tanya pulled him close as they walked toward the subway, her arm draped over his shoulder. "Your father would have loved that last move, Joseph," she whispered. Joseph reached into his pocket, fingering the scholarship card and the memory of the Ebony King. "He saw it coming, Mama," Joseph said, looking toward the skyline where the lights were beginning to flicker on like squares on a board. "He just left it for me to finish the game." The invisible boy was gone. The tournament was coming. And for Joseph Williams, the opening was finally over. The real game was about to begin.